Okay. Oh, we have a few more joining us. Oh, nice. Welcome. You came too late, though, to be put on the list for receiving your midterms early. The people who came only for the first half of the class. I hope I didn't already lose that list. Anyway. Oh, you took... No. You came just now, right? No. What's your name? Muftul. Okay, well, how about this? I'll write a line, and everyone under the line, you may or may not get your grades next week. The people who came early, though. Okay, and your name, wait, I know your name. You're Fatma, right? Where did you write your... Oh, so everyone...
First you'll read this, and after...
That's right. They get higher priority because they came to both hours of class. Okay. Okay, so anyway, back to the lecture. Now, we talked a lot about Europe. Remember, the Ottomans are kind of on the outside of the system. They're not really invited in. They're not allowed to attend the Congress of Vienna. They're not really part of any of these systems, whether it's the Congress system or the Concert of Europe. But remember that in a way, the whole thing is still kind of about the Ottoman Empire. Again, confusingly. And frankly, I find the period in history between about, let's say, like 1820 and 1833, if you're looking at Ottoman history, I mean, it's exceptionally confusing. It's bewildering. It's bizarre, frankly. I mean, it's really difficult to kind of perceive and understand. Maybe the easiest way of thinking about it, again, is as this quote-unquote Eastern question, that the secret to the survival of the Ottoman Empire is the rivalry of the different European states, which again are not necessarily pro-Ottoman. In fact, very few of them really are. But they are all against other states carving up the Ottoman Empire. I mean, if you look back in strategic terms at various alliances, or at least agreements, between the Ottomans and European powers. Traditionally, remember, the Ottoman Empire had been allied to which major European power? I'm talking about like back in the 1500s, 1600s. Which European power tended? France, right. France, mostly because back in those days, the Ottoman Empire's main enemy in Europe was which power? That is not its ally, but its enemy. For most of the time.
Britain? Spanish?
No, its enemy, who the Ottomans fought.
Russia?
No, I'm talking about earlier. Austria, there we go. Okay, Austria, right. I'm talking about the earlier period, not the 19th century. Remember, all of those sieges of Vienna, the fountains of Buda and all the rest, right? Austria's the main enemy, so France was the main ally. Well, now we've entered a new era, right, where the main enemy is probably Russia. Certainly, that was made manifest with Kuchukanaja, which we've talked about before. The Russians go on and directly annex Crimea, the Crimea, in 1783. There's another war I didn't even put up there, the war of the late 1780s, Treaty of Jassy, 1792. The Russians, they're getting closer and closer. They're sort of starting to wrap themselves around the Ottoman Empire. The Russians have also moved down in the Caucasus, Transcaucasia, or the Transcaucasus. Georgia is incorporated into Russia in 1801, although they have not yet subdued the rebels under Shamil, up in the mountains. Russia now is kind of pushed down, and they're threatening Persia to the southeast. They're threatening the Ottomans to the southwest. The Ottomans still have these great fortresses at places like Kars, but things are looking like, again, if you just look at the map, the Russians are starting to kind of envelop the Ottoman Empire. So Russia's probably the main enemy. But then remember, not always. Napoleon invades Egypt, 1798. The Ottomans actually ally themselves with Russia for 4 years. They actually staged joint operations in the Adriatic with the Russians. It's pretty amazing. Here again you have that kind of mysterious process of the Eastern question that tosses all things up in the air. They come down in strange combinations, right? Napoleon as the great threat, he's such a great threat that the Russians are willing to work with the Ottomans because the Russians, of course, don't want Napoleon to dominate the Ottoman Empire. Nor, of course, do the British. And so Britain, remember, famously, of course, helps the Ottomans expel, or at the very least stop, Napoleon at Acre, the Battle of Acre, which we've talked a lot about, Sidney Smith and all of that. They fight a couple more battles, then they occupy Egypt, and then they leave. But the French imprint is still kind of there. Again, this is something to keep in your mind. Mehmet Ali, or as I believe you call him, Cavallala, right? Cavallala, Mehmet Ali, he kind of has learned from the French and from all of the French advisors and attachés left behind. He begins actually to modernize Egypt's own armed forces in such a way that they become, to a certain extent, more advanced than the Ottomans. So Egypt is now, it's confusing. It's still part of the Ottoman Empire, but it's kind of under French influence, but also kind of under British influence. Okay, so you have the Russian factor, you've got the French factor, you've got the British factor. Now you have Metternich, who, remember, wants to keep all the other powers from meddling. But that, of course, is easier said than done. Russia, we're not yet talking about like the Pan-Slavic era, which is later on when the Russians are looking at things like the Bulgars and the Serbs and every Slavic people. They're still talking more about religion. It's still more about the Orthodox faith. The pretext, one of the pretexts of the Küçük-Kaynarca Treaty is that Russia has this claim to protect the Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there are other practical elements too. They have a certain right of shipping, which is actually given to the Greeks, but it's so that the Greeks can trade in the Black Sea with the Russians. They're starting, that is, to make certain claims which infringe upon Ottoman sovereignty, even above and beyond the capitulation that you know about. Things like a claim to protect at least certain Orthodox churches. Okay, so the Russians have this religious element. There's a kind of French, almost like a military element, but that's more prominent in Egypt than in the capital. And meanwhile, you have the Ottomans trying desperately to ward off all of these different threats. Under Selim III, you have the first effort to reform the military along Western lines. Some of this, remember, we talked about in the very first week, this whole dilemma of how do you meet, again, the Western threat. You know, do you copy the West with their tactics and their drill and so on? That's kind of what he tried to do with the first version of a modern Ottoman army, the Nizam-i Jadid, which I probably wrote it up. I don't know where I wrote it. Maybe it's down here. No, I think it probably is up there, right. Nizam-i Jadid, yeah. But this, again, angers you call them the Yeniceri, or the Janissaries, who, of course, are jealous of their own prerogatives, you know, who for a very long time, not just do they have their own military tradition, but they have all of these other curious traditions in the capital. You know, they have various kind of almost like guilds and unions. You know, they run some of like the butcher shops and the bakeries. And even my favorite, the fire brigade. The way the story was usually told was because, you know, they controlled the kind of the firemen's union or whatever it's called. They would frequently set fires so that they could then, you know, put them out. Yeah, what do you call it, Yangın? Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, you set the fire, then you put out the fire. It's kind of almost like mafia style. Now, there was another factor with the Janissaries which is quite important. We call it in English the accession donative. That is the bonus that the Sultan would have to give whenever there was a new Sultan. And partly because of this, because they got a bonus whenever there was a new Sultan, of course, they frequently would have a rebellion so there would be a new Sultan, because then they would get a new bonus. So you have discipline problems in the army, you have the strategic threat, and all of this comes together, and Selim tries to modernize the army, but of course he fails. The Janissaries suppress this. Things are starting to look a little bit dangerous in the Ottoman Empire, particularly in Europe. The Serbs, they take the first semi-serious step. They declare kind of autonomy. This is way back in 1804. Now, they're not recognized by the other powers. They're not independent yet. It happens in like this process of stages. But a precedent is already being set, you know, that some of these national groups are going to slowly erode the kind of multi-ethnic fabric of the Ottoman Empire. The Serbs declare independence. You also have, it's one of my favorite names in Ottoman history, Tepedelenli Pasha, right? You have a different name for him, or? Tepedelenli. And Tepedelenli, I mean, he's sort of like half Pasha, half bandit. A little bit like Jezar had been, you remember, in Syria, Damascus, and then Acca. He's kind of like a self-made pasha, you might say. He becomes something like a kind of self-appointed viceroy in Albania and Greece. A warlord, in a way, if you will. And that's actually how he's seen. I mean, for a while, the Ottomans are not going to move against him because, in a way, they're almost like afraid of him. And remember, they can barely control their own army at this time, right? But it's important to remember that although he himself, he's sort of pro-Ottoman. I mean, he's Muslim, right? And so he's not really like the Serbs in declaring hostility to the Ottoman Empire. He claims that he's kind of like serving the Ottoman Empire. But still, he represents the same problem of the leaking away of authority in the provinces. And in fact, curiously, if you actually look at the chronology of the thing, even though he himself is probably best described as Albanian, he kind of sets the Greek rebellion in motion. Again, this is partly by demanding more prerogatives and kind of claiming more land. The Ottomans actually declare him a rebel, and they send forces to try to depose him. And this, in a curious way, sets off this kind of chain reaction that eventually leads to the Greek rebellion. It's not that the Greeks are inspired by Tepetilenli Pasha. It's rather that his own role in eroding Ottoman authority in what is Albania and what is now modern Greece or northern Greece convinced a lot of these Greek conspirators that Ottoman power was on the out, and so the time had come to strike. It's true they had a secret society going back. I should probably, I think, switch to the next board here. They had this secret society called the Filiki Eteria, which there are various versions of this which will appear again and again in the 19th century. You sometimes hear this phrase, the great idea. This idea, the Russians had their own version of it with the Second Rome. The Greek idea, of course, they don't want the Russians to control Constantinople. They want to control it themselves. The idea that it and the Hagia Sophia, the Hagia Sophia, are, again, the true center of the Orthodox faith. So yes, you get various conspiracies and so on. And there were some Greek families that kind of like went a little bit both ways. I mean, that's one of the most, again, confusing things about late Ottoman history, is there are all these Greeks and Armenians, who are serving very, very high up in the Ottoman government, who are running things like, the armory, and they're actually, making the guns. They're doing a lot of the banking. They're building a lot of the, everything from the palaces themselves, like architects, to specific things that the sultans wanted. Some of them were actually favored by the sultans. But a few of them, of course, were kind of conspiring with the other side. A man who was caught in the middle was the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, Gregory V, who himself, after, one might say, his subordinate, the metropolitan. It's a slightly different hierarchy than in the Catholic Church. The metropolitan is kind of like, one or two ranks below the patriarch. And he, in the Peloponnese, that is in Greece, declares this kind of rebellion. He raises the cross and so on. The patriarch denounces him, and he says, no, rebels against the Ottoman Empire shall be excommunicated. He actually denounces it. Now, however, almost certainly the patriarch had connections in this society, and it's probably true that although he himself did not authorize it, he probably had met with some of the conspirators on various occasions. It's the kind of thing you can't really prove one way or another. The Ottomans, though, thought he was guilty, or at the very least that he had done nothing to prevent this catastrophe. And so, of course, they, first he excommunicates the rebels, and then the Ottomans execute him. Interesting, I don't remember who it was who actually murdered Tepetilenli Pasha, but interestingly, he's killed too, at about the same time. So you have the patriarch being executed, you have the kind of the great Albanian rebel leader being executed. Things, in other words, are really beginning to spiral out of control very rapidly. This is one of those moments, and there are going to be a number more like it in the 19th century and early 20th century, when if you were, let's say, what we like to call in English a betting man, you would not have bet on the Ottoman Empire. You probably would not have, say, loaned it money or bonds. You probably would not expect that it would have lasted very long. Not least because the whole Greek thing had become sort of a fashionable cause. We usually sum this up with the phrase, the Philhellenes. they were a little bit nuts, frankly, the Philhellenes. I mean, Lord Byron was the most famous of them. I'm going to see if I can unearth a good Byron quote for you. I mean, there are a lot of them. I mean, yeah, some of them are just humbug, rubbish. He's talking about, the ancient honors of your race, descendants of Homer and Aristotle and Plato. And by this he supposedly meant that the modern Greek rebels were descended from the ancient Greek philosophers, which is not only literally untrue in kind of like racial terms, but in other terms was completely ridiculous, because the whole point of the ancient Greek world strategically, remember, was the phalanx, where everyone had this close order battle formation. Whereas the modern kleps, were much more like guerrilla warriors who would just stage these hit and run attacks and go back into the mountains. They were the very opposite, that is, of a tight European close order battle formation in terms of their tactics. But that said, there was a lot of romance to it. I'm going to see. What was my favorite quote of his? It was something about how much he liked the Greeks, even though he thought they were more cowardly than the Turks. But basically, the people he loved the most were the Albanians. And the reason was because he found them attractive. Well, yeah, it's true. I mean, that was the real motivation for Lord Byron. He supposedly was in love with an Albanian rebel. And so he and people like him took up this cause, against the Ottomans. Now, but that said, again, it's confusing. It's not an official position of the British government. You've got volunteers like Lord Byron who go to Greece to support the rebels. On the other hand, Britain and France did, of course, fight and win the key naval battle of the era, the Battle of Navarino in 1827, where it was the Russians had like liaison officers, but it was basically a British and French show where they destroyed the Ottoman Navy, which more or less enabled Greek independence. It made it possible. So they're willing to intervene up to a point, but only up to a point. In fact, although Greece won its independence, it was nothing like the territory of course, of modern Greece today. It was basically the Peloponnese and then just, about 30 miles north of Athens, so barely all of Attica. So that part of Greece did become independent, and Britain and France and Russia did support that. I think what must have happened, though, is on the one hand, they wanted to support this movement, at least because, again, there was a lot of public opinion now in Britain and France behind the Greek rebels. It was a very popular cause. But they didn't want to let it go too far, because, of course, if the Ottoman Empire actually fell apart, then you might have a major European war. Making things more dangerous, and again, very confusingly, if you follow all the alliances, the Russians actually declared war in 1828. Not to win Greek independence, per se. Greek was already basically independent by this point. But rather because Russia decided that the time had presumably come to make its own push. And so the Russians push on in the Caucasus, and they batter the fortress of Kars and take Kars. They push down through the Balkans, and they make it all the way to Edirne, or Adrianople as it was still then called, where they dictate another one of these kind of punitive peace treaties against the Ottomans. And so Russia has now joined in. But Russia too stops at Edirne. And then, curiously, Russia decides again that not only does it not want to conquer Constantinople, but that Russia does not want the Ottoman Empire to fall apart. Now again, it's not like this was some coherent policy that had probably been worked out in advance. I think it's more a matter of response to onrushing events. Now, of which the most confusing, again, is of course what happens with Kavalala, and his son and kind of like his chief lieutenant, Ibrahim, who first goes to fight the Greek rebels, remember, in the Peloponnese, and then later on musters an army which invades Syria from Egypt, almost Napoleon style, and then makes it as far as Kütahya, that is right here in Anadolu. This is by about February of 1833. What happens next? Does anyone know, with Kavalala, Mehmet Ali threatening to take the capital and depose the Ottoman dynasty? Does anyone know what happens? No?
Russians comes.
Russia sent troops to save the Ottoman dynasty against Kavalala. They sent about 30,000 troops in all, of which 14,000 actually camped on the Asian shore of the Bosporus, that is the Boaz. This is in the summer of 1833. Russia actually sent its own troops to preserve the Ottoman Empire. You get your mind around that. It's really extraordinary, when you think about it. And it only worked for a little while because, after all, Cavallo mustered another army 6 years later and very nearly conquered the city again. That time the British, too, threatened to intervene if Mehmet Ali were to attack Constantinople. So remember, when Napoleon was the threat, Russia was willing to team up with the Ottomans, as was Britain. It's curious that Britain was not the power that sent the troops in 1833. You might expect that they would have been. But for curious reasons, they were preoccupied with other affairs at the time. It wasn't like it was a conscious decision not to. It was just that the Russians responded more quickly because the British were kind of like preoccupied with other things. But so it could be the British, but it could also even be the Russians. The kind of central diplomatic fact, again, is that in the end, none of the European powers wants the Ottoman Empire to fall apart, because it will eventually lead to a war between all of them. And it's not just that other European powers can conquer the Ottomans. Apparently, the Egyptians can do so too. I mean, that to me is the most amazing thing. If you also juxtapose this with the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire, I didn't even talk about the Janissary Rebellion of 1826, suppressed, of course, brutally by Mahmud II, and his own forces, who I think killed something like 10,000 Janissaries, many of them executed in cold blood. The whole point of that, remember, was to modernize the army so that it could more effectively hold off the advance of a European army. Well, that was 1826. What? 2 years later, the Russians are at Edirne. 5 years later, Mehmet Ali Cavallo is at Kütahya. And so obviously, whatever they were trying to accomplish by suppressing the Janissaries didn't work very well. At least, not initially. Maybe it just took a longer time for the reforms to pay off. The reforms being, again, the adoption of European uniforms, the adoption of kind of European drill and training techniques. In the 1830s, they even invite in a team of German advisors, led by Helmut von Moltke, Moltke the Elder, as he's usually called, the same one who masterminded the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and the father of the same Moltke who would command the German armies in 1914. He actually came and visited Turkey for several years in the 1830s, trying to modernize the army. And although it's not generally known, he left in disgust, thinking that it was a fool's errand and that nothing could basically be done. But curiously, the upshot of all of this, all these disasters for the Ottoman Empire, where they keep, again, surviving by the skin of their teeth, by the end of this, the Ottoman Empire actually enters a fairly glorious age, what's sometimes called the Second Golden Age, at least the capital city for most of the 19th century. Some of it was, yes, the palace building, the building of Galatasaray, the first university, but also certain fashions coming in. The Tanzimat era, obviously liberal reform, some of it meant or designed, again, to please the European powers like Britain and France. In a curious way, the Ottoman Empire became a symbol of everything that the Europeans wanted to preserve. A symbol, in a way, again, of the Metternich system, of this idea of preserving a multi-ethnic empire, where the Galata Bridge, famously, was actually described, I think it was by, it wasn't the ambassador, but it was a visitor from Japan who actually described it as the bridge where 10,000 nations meet. So many different groups from all over the world, crossing the Galata Bridge. That was his description of it. The Ottoman Empire becomes almost like this bulwark against modernity, against these forces of liberalism, popular sovereignty, irredentism, and nationalism. Or in a curious way, despite the fact that, to be really honest, they kind of have contempt for the Ottoman Empire, the Europeans also come to value it very highly. I mean, this paradox is, I think, it's best actually encapsulated in this British ambassador, Stratford Canning de Redcliffe. I'll talk a little more about him when we get to the Crimean War, but what I find so fascinating about him is that the people who knew him well Well, actually, the people who knew him well didn't like him much. There was a story where he once fell off his horse in a riding accident, but survived. And all of his servants in the embassy, they all raised a toast to better luck next time. He didn't really have much regard for Turkey or for Turks. But he was the mastermind of the pro-Turkish coalition in the Crimean War. It was basically largely because of this one man that Britain and France went to war on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. He had this very curious attitude. Again, it was kind of like contempt mixed together with regard. He actually was seen by a lot of people in the Ottoman Empire as more powerful than the Grand Vizier. I mean, but by the 1850s, things have become almost a caricature. It's not just the capitulations, but the European embassies, like Ottoman cabinet meetings by that era, are actually sometimes held inside the European embassies. Like the British embassy was seen almost like it was the Ottoman cabinet by the 1850s, when Britain was taking like a more direct role in the Ottoman Empire. So again, paradoxically, the power is seeping away from the Ottoman Empire. But it's become more valuable than ever. Because the Ottoman Empire, in a way, is the only thing which is preventing the European powers from kind of tearing each other apart. Which nearly happens in 1853 with the Crimean War, nearly happens in 1877 when Russia invades, and of course finally does happen in 1914, when by that point there is no Metternich or Bismarck around, to cushion the blow. So that the Eastern question, I mean, this is one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by it. Again, it's all the paradoxes in it. Ottoman weakness in the end leads the Ottoman Empire to be much more highly valued in a way than any of the other countries in Europe, where the status quo or the preservation of Ottoman control comes to be valued really by all the European powers in turn. Even curiously by the Russians, again, who are willing to send troops to defend the capital so that the dynasty doesn't fall apart. Well, that's all I had for today. If we do have a little bit of time left, I could maybe open for questions. Do we have a bit of time? Oh, we have 20 minutes. Okay, well, very good. Well, I don't have your midterms done yet, but I promised those who are on this sheet. Did we finish with the sheet? Yeah, okay. So those above the magic line, I give you my my promise, my söz, my guarantee that I will have your exams by next Tuesday. Well, listen, since I did wrap up a little bit early today, why don't we see, are there questions? They could also even go back to the midterm or, any of the prior periods or anything we covered today on Metternich or the Eastern question. Yes?
Can you answer the question in the midterm about Napoleon's 2 wars or 2 campaigns?
2 wars or 2 battles?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Because I discussed with my friend, I know that in Egypt, Napoleon went to Egypt and he conquered there.
Mm-hmm.
My friends told me that Egypt was a defeat for Napoleon.
Well, Syria was a defeat for Napoleon. The Battle of the Nile, where Nelson and the British Navy destroyed the French fleet, but that's off the coast of Egypt. That was certainly a loss for Napoleon. The land battles in Egypt, though, from Alexandria to the Battle of Pyramids outside Cairo, and even later the Battle of Abukir, which was on land, were all victories for Napoleon. Yeah.
War, Pyramids Wars?
The Battle of the Pyramids.
Okay, then I wrote it.
The Battle of the Pyramids was the one, again, in sight of Cairo on the other side of the Nile, with the squares where they were able to hold off the Mamluk cavalry advancing. There were other battles in Syria, the important ones. Well, eventually, they won most of the battles. At Battle of Mount Tabor, they actually routed the entire army of Damascus of 250,000. But they were not able to take Acre, the fortress. They laid siege to the city of Acre, an old crusader city, where Jazar Pasha was holed up along with the British. So if you're going to sum up, you can say Napoleon did not win that battle. so that he ultimately did not conquer Syria, but he did conquer Egypt. He left behind an occupying army in Egypt. Eventually they left, but when Napoleon left, they were still in charge of Egypt. Yeah, are there other questions? I mean, on the midterm or on today? Yeah.
You said in the first hour that there was a justification for Russia to declare war of Crimean War.
Ah, right. Yeah, I didn't want to go too far into the Crimean War today because we're going to cover that in another lecture, but it's a good question. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, this was the claim. Russia thought that it had, it's a bit confusing, Russia claimed in the 1850s that there was a clause in the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca granting Russia protection rights over the Orthodox subjects and even many of the Orthodox churches in the Ottoman Empire. However, the actual wording, and they may not have known this because it was such an old treaty that the Tsar might have been misinformed, the actual wording spoke only of a single church in Constantinople which was to be built, that they had a kind of protection right over a single church. What had really happened was that they had risen to the bait laid by Napoleon III. I haven't talked about him yet. We'll have a whole class about him. But in the Revolution of 1848, France goes through temporarily a kind of second republic, and then they have elections for president, and famously Louis Napoleon wins simply because his name is Napoleon. He's got name recognition. This is actually the source, incidentally, of Marx's other famous line about religion being the opium of the masses. What he really meant was that peasants, because they're superstitious and believe in God, are easily manipulated. And he's kind of talking about how they all voted for this Napoleon guy, even though he had never even lived in France, which was true. He'd lived mostly in Italy. Well, so this Napoleon, he's elected president, and then later on he kind of has a coup. He proclaims himself emperor. Now, he doesn't really have much of a foreign policy. Basically, what he wants to do is kind of amuse himself and entertain himself. And he wants France to be more influential, yes. He doesn't have any idea as to why. But so what he tries to do then is to destroy the Metternich system precisely by stirring up the powers. In this case, Russia. So France makes a claim to protect the holy places, like in Bethlehem. France had its own claims in the Levant, in what is now kind of Lebanon and Palestine, going back to the time of the Crusades. They were more, again, kind of symbolic claims than anything else. But basically, he did this just so he could piss off the Russians, because he wanted the Russians to react, so that maybe they would, go to war. Which ultimately they did, although the Russians did not want to go to war. When we look at the Crimean War, we'll see which country was actually much keener on the war than the Russians. It's a very good question, though, because, again, it's one of those things where the myth was more important than the reality. It's not the actual clauses of Küçük-Kaynarca that mattered. It was what Russia believed to be in the treaty that mattered. It was not actually there. All Russia gained from this treaty specifically was that they were going to build a church in Constantinople, and they would have a kind of right to, watch over it and protect it and its congregants, presumably. That's all the treaty actually said. But a myth rapidly developed that the treaty had given Russia these broad protection rights over all of the Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire, which was potentially very important because the Orthodox section of the Ottoman population was almost a third. So it was like a third of the population. And if Russia is claiming, again, kind of almost like a capitulation or protection right, then it very easily could be called a violation of Ottoman sovereignty, which is why the other powers were willing to fight the Russians over it. Again, whether the Russians were misinformed or whether they, cynically and deliberately lied about this is, obviously that's a matter of taste. I'm not sure, but it's a very good question. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Was 18th Brumaire about something about
Oh, right. Yeah, again, because we have a whole week for Napoleon III. But no, this is good. I'm glad you brought this up because I sort of allude to this stuff, but I didn't explain it. This was Marx's phrase. If we remember the Brumaire, The original Brumaire in 1799, this was the month when the first Napoleon staged his coup. Remember, he surrounded the parliament, the Council of 500. You know, he made some ridiculous speech. They attacked him. Then he claimed they were all English spies, and he had them all arrested. It was this, again, kind of semi-farcical, but actually deeply serious thing, because this led to, of course, Napoleon becoming dictator. So this is what Marx meant when he said, literally he was talking about this, when he said the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. What happened the second time was, this is in what, 1851, Napoleon III is already president. And he didn't even really have the creativity to have this kind of legal cause. What he basically did was he just arrested several thousand of his political opponents and declared himself emperor. It really was not terribly subtle. You know, there was no pretext. There was no justification. He just kind of said, now I'm the emperor, basically. You know, the first Napoleon had actually waited 5 years before. Remember, he was consul, and he was consul for life, you know. And then he was emperor, and he put the crown on his head. His nephew, the farce, that's what Marx calls himself, yeah, he just sort of arrested everyone and said, I'm now the emperor. So this is what Marx is talking about. Again, it's like history repeating itself in different ways. That France was kind of doing the same thing, only this time it was, you know, it was not sublime, it was ridiculous. You know, it was this guy, Napoleon III, you know, who frankly spoke French with an accent, because he had spent most of his life in Italy. He had never really even been in France, and now suddenly he's the emperor. Lucky guy. You know, as Mel Brooks said, it is good to be the emperor. Or he said, it is good to be the king. That's a good question. Is there anything else I wrote on the board that I didn't cover? I'm sure there probably is. But yeah, I mean, we'll have plenty of time to look at Napoleon III and the Crimean War. I didn't want to go too far into it, you know, today. But obviously, since it is so intimately related to all of this, I mean, just to anticipate a little bit, Napoleon III essentially sets out to break up this system because he thought the whole thing was designed against France. And so that's why he wants Russia to get angry. That's why he wants Russia to get involved in the Ottoman Empire. And he gets more or less what he wants. He creates this crisis which leads to the Crimean War. Austria splits apart with Russia, and the whole system is kind of broken apart. And then again, as I said, paradoxically, the Ottomans are finally invited into the concert of Europe once it no longer matters. You know, it's a little bit like, you know, winning a prize that doesn't actually, you know, count for anything. Or as it's a good line from a novel. This guy talked about what it meant to become a tenured professor at like Eastern Pennsylvania State College or something like that. And he said, it's a little bit like being proclaimed the winner of a eating contest. I can't say the word because it's... Anyway, that's sort of it. Like the Ottomans... You know, they win the Crimean War and they're invited into the concert of Europe. Once it no longer matters at all, and once the powers are no longer meeting together in the same way as before, once Austria and Russia are no longer allied, once the Holy Alliance no longer exists, etc., etc. Now, I don't want to exaggerate entirely. I mean, the tradition endures kind of, the concert of Europe. I mean, really, right even up until, you know, 1914, the powers continued to meet from time to time. But the principles which united them are no longer there. And particularly the common interests, you know, Prussia, Russia, and Austria are no longer there after 1856. Particularly because, you know, the genie of nationalism is unleashed again and you get Italian and German unification. But yeah, we'll have plenty of time for that when we get to Napoleon III and Bismarck. So are there any other questions? Good. Well, as I said, we're not doing a regular class this Friday. We will have a regular class next Wednesday. No class Friday. For you lucky recipients here, you will get. I'll do my best. I can probably finish all of these by Wednesday. I will have your midterms by Wednesday. And then next Friday, I think it's probably right before the Bayram. So, but those who came late. I know it's not a Bayram, but I figure everyone will be gone anyway, so we're not going to have class. What we're going to do instead is the Friday after the Bayram, we're going to have like a long 2 to 3 hour thing where we're going to watch a movie. So, yeah. Master and Commander.